60 of the most powerful people in New England were watching when Marisol Vance Drury spat a mouthful of cake onto a china plate and let the sound of it ring through the ballroom. She was 31, beautiful the way a locked door is beautiful, and she was engaged to the man whose birthday they'd all come to celebrate. The cake had been carried in by a kitchen girl named Rosie Holloway, 27 years old, hands scarred from a fire she'd walked back into, wearing an apron she had washed herself that morning, 'cause nobody else would. The box was made of plain cardboard, tied with a twist tie. Marisol looked at it the way you look at something that's tracked mud across your floor, and then she tasted it, and for half a second something crossed her face that nobody in that room caught. Then she tilted the plate. The cake went face down onto the marble, and her heel came down on top of it. Something small and wooden fell out of Rosie's apron and cracked underneath. "Clean it up," Marisol said. "That's what you're for, isn't it?" And Rosie knelt. She didn't argue. She didn't lift her eyes. She gathered the crumbs into a napkin with 2 burned hands, while people she had served for over a year looked at their shoes. What none of them knew, not one of the 60, not the woman in the red dress, was that the recipe for that cake had died 23 years earlier, with a Sicilian woman named Constance Ferraro. In a basement kitchen that had been locked ever since, in a house where speaking her name had once been enough to end a man's career, and her son, Augustine Ferraro, 34 years old, who ran the harbor and half the concrete in Providence, who'd buried 3 men since spring without ever raising his voice, was in the next room on the phone and never smelled a thing. He wasn't to find out that night. He'd find out at 3 in the morning, alone, in the dark, because he could never sleep on his birthday. He'd come down for water and find a second cake, small, sitting in a tin that hadn't been closed all the way, next to a broken wooden spoonful nobody had bothered to sweep up. The kitchen would be cold. The cake would be cold. Only the smell would still be alive. And he'd eat 1 bite standing over the counter, and then he'd sit down on the tile floor of his own mansion. And for the first time in 23 years, the most feared man in Rhode Island would put his face in his hands. 12 hours after that heel came down, he'd walk into the same room, look at the woman wearing his ring, and ask her a question so quiet that the men by the door leaned forward to hear it. "Who gave you permission to touch my gift?" Before we go on, if this is the kind of story you're here for, take a second to like this video and hit subscribe. Share it with somebody who's ever been made small in a room full of people who should have known better. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Now let's go back to that ballroom, back to the girl on her knees with the crumbs in her hands, because the truth about that cake goes back further than anyone in that house was ready for. 4 weeks before the night the cake landed face down on the marble floor, on Friday evening, October 23rd, a small restaurant on Atwells Avenue had displayed its closed sign since 9 o'clock, but the lights inside were still burning, and at table number 4, 2 sets of silverware had been arranged neatly, as though waiting for a meeting no one wanted to attend. Augustine Ferraro sat on the inside with his back to the wall, slowly turning his mother's wedding ring around the little finger on his hand. And he didn't look at the clock once, because men like him didn't need to measure time. Time already knew how to wait. The man who was brought inside was named Oswald Brink, 40 years old, with thinning hair and a coat too light for the October cold in Providence, and he crossed the threshold with the walk of a man who had spent the entire journey telling himself that everything could still be explained. No one held his arms. No one touched him. Hal Dunbridge, 62 years old, stood in the doorway behind him with both hands clasped before his stomach, like a church caretaker waiting for a service to begin, and he said nothing. Gus pointed to the chair across from him. Oswald sat down. A plate of pasta had already been placed on the table, still steaming, handmade noodles with slowly cooked tomato sauce, and a little finely chopped basil scattered over the top, along with a sliced loaf of bread resting in a wicker basket. And Gus poured the wine for him with his own hand, filling the glass to the line with the care of a waiter who had practiced the trade for 30 years. He had never been a drinker. He merely set the bottle down, turned the label so it faced the guest, and sat in silence. Oswald opened his mouth to speak, and Gus gave the smallest shake of his head only once, and the man understood immediately that words were the one thing no one wanted to hear that night. So he picked up his fork. For the next 40 minutes, not one sentence was spoken inside that room. There was the sound of a fork touching porcelain. The sound of the man swallowing, the creak of the chair when he shifted, and the hiss of heating pipes somewhere inside the walls. The sound every old house in New England made near the end of October. Oswald ate slowly at first, then more quickly, then slowly again when he began to understand that the plate of pasta wasn't a dinner but an allotment of time, and once people understood such things, they usually tried to stretch them. He wiped the plate clean with the last piece of bread. He finished the wine. Then he placed the fork down neatly, parallel to the knife, exactly as his mother had taught him 35 years earlier, and perhaps it was the first time in his life he had ever done it correctly. Gus looked at the empty plate. He looked at it longer than he looked at the man. 2 young people had died in Federal Hill the previous month, both under 20 years old, both buying from the same source. And during the past 3 weeks, Gus had read their names exactly once in the newspaper, then folded the paper and never opened it again. He didn't speak to Oswald about that. He didn't need to. No one invited a man to dinner at 9 o'clock on a Friday night inside a closed restaurant to discuss something already done. Gus stood, took his coat from the back of the chair, and put it on slowly, adjusting the collar and brushing an invisible thread from one shoulder. Then he spoke, and his voice was so quiet that Oswald had to lean forward, just as the men standing by the door would have to lean closer 4 weeks later inside a ballroom in order to hear clearly. "Take him to the harbor," Gus said. "He has eaten. My mother never allowed anyone to die hungry." Oswald Brink didn't cry out. He only looked up, and on his face was the expression of a man who had just realized that kindness and cruelty sometimes wore the same suit, and that for 40 minutes he had been eating with the thing that waited for him outside. 2 men escorted him away. No one jerked him. No one dragged him. He walked between them, and he even stopped for 1 second at the threshold to fasten the button on his coat, which was too thin, because it was cold outside, and people still buttoned their coats even when it no longer meant anything. Hal Dunbridge took a small leather-bound notebook from inside his coat. He had been writing in notebooks like that for 36 years, and no one had ever read them. Not even Gus. He wrote 1 short line, without a name or date, only a symbol that he alone understood, then closed the notebook and returned it to his pocket. He looked at Gus and said nothing. Gus didn't look at him either. He was looking at the plate. The restaurant door closed behind the 3 men, and all that remained in the room was the yellow light, 2 sets of silverware, an empty wine glass, and a plate polished clean without a single strand of pasta left on it. Gus stood there for a long while. He didn't think about Oswald Brink. He would never think about Oswald Brink again, and 29 days later, while sitting on the cold tile floor of his own kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning, he would try to remember the man's name and fail, but he would remember the plate. He would remember that the man had eaten everything. And he would remember that he himself had spoken his mother's name to seal what happened. That he had taken a woman who once cooked for an entire neighborhood and turned her into the reason another man never returned home, and that thought would find him in the darkness, too late, amid the lingering smell of cake, inside a cold kitchen. But that night, he didn't know any of it yet. That night, he only turned off the lights, locked the restaurant, and drove home to the house on the hill, where a basement door had remained locked for 23 years, and where, at 1 o'clock in the morning, beneath the kitchen lights, a 27-year-old woman was washing the last stack of dishes, and had no idea who the man about to walk through the door truly was, 3 weeks before the night on Atwell's Avenue. On a Friday evening in early October, the mansion on the hill hosted what Marisol Vance Drury called an intimate dinner. Even though it consisted of 7 courses and a private chef flown in from Newport every weekend. The first course was oysters, the second was a kind of squash soup sprinkled with toasted hazelnuts. The third was sea bass grilled over oak charcoal, and Augustine Ferraro ate 3 bites in all 7 courses, 3 literal countable bites. He set down his fork during the 3rd course, wiped his mouth with the cloth napkin, and stood. No one asked why. People had stopped asking long ago. The chef from Newport never knew he had prepared 7 courses for a man who would touch only 3 bites, because Barnaby Quill always cleared the plates before the chef came out of the kitchen, and always told him that the master was extremely pleased, and the chef always believed him because he was paid to believe. Inside the large refrigerator in the main kitchen, behind trays of meat and bundles of vegetables with their ties still intact, 7 paper boxes stood in a row on the lowest shelf. Each box bore the name of a different bakery. There was one from Boston with gold lettering embossed on the lid, one from New Haven, a small shop on Federal Street whose owner was an elderly Italian woman who had retired the previous year, one from Brooklyn that required orders 6 weeks in advance, and 3 others whose names no one in the house could remember anymore. Every box had been opened. Every box remained untouched except for one small corner the size of a thumb, where a fork had cut down exactly once and lifted away. No box had been eaten beyond a single bite. Barnaby replaced them every month. No one had ordered him to do it. He simply did it because he knew his master would open the refrigerator at some hour of the night, stand there looking at that row of paper boxes, choose one, cut a bite, and place it back where it had been. And he knew what would appear on the man's face after the first taste, the expression of someone who had spoken a name into the darkness and discovered that the room was still empty. Barnaby had never told anyone about the boxes. On the first Monday morning of every month, he carried them to the trash, wrapped carefully in brown paper bags, and walked all the way to the end of the driveway so no one in the kitchen would see. That evening, after Gus left the dining table, Marisol remained seated. She finished her own glass of wine, then drank the rest of his, and spoke to a female friend visiting from Boston about the cellar. She had been talking about the cellar for 3 months. On the plans the architect had sent, the eastern section of the basement was shaded pale blue and labeled potential space, a phrase Marisol liked so much that she repeated it 3 times during one meal. She wanted a wine cellar. She wanted a spiral steel staircase, walnut shelving, and a glass wall so guests could see the collection from the sitting room above. She had already chosen the lights. She had paid the contractor a deposit, and she had accounted for the door. There was a door at the end of the basement hallway, made of dark oak, about 1 hand span shorter than the others, with an iron lock so deeply rusted that the keyway could no longer be seen. No one in the mansion possessed its key. No one ever spoke about it. The cleaners mopped that hallway every week, and never wiped the door, and no one had ever instructed them not to. They simply didn't touch it, in the same way people stepped around a wet place on the floor without needing to be told. Marisol rose from the dining table with the rolled plans in her hand and went to find Gus. He was in the study, sitting before a dark window, turning the ring on his little finger. She spread the plans across the desk, weighing down the 4 corners with whatever lay within reach, and she spoke about the lighting, the walnut, and the fact that a magazine in Boston wanted to photograph the house in the spring, and that a wine cellar would completely transform the composition of the photographs. She spoke for 3 minutes. She spoke well. She always spoke well. That was what her family had spent 20 years paying people to teach her. And she ended by saying that the old door at the end of the hallway would have to be removed, that it was only a door, that there was nothing behind it but dust, and that the contractor could finish the work in a single morning. Gus didn't turn around. He didn't look at the plans. He said only one word, and it fell into the room like something very heavy dropped from a great height. No, Marisol had lived with this man for 3 years. She had heard him speak to men who would never return home, and even then his voice had remained as flat as water at the bottom of a well. She had heard him end a $40 million contract in exactly 3 sentences without a single tendon moving in his neck. But that word had been different. A very fine crack ran through its center, so thin that she would have missed it if she hadn't been standing exactly 3 feet away. She recognized it immediately, in the way a woman recognizes that the man she intends to marry has just revealed a room inside himself she has never been permitted to enter. She rolled up the plans. She said all right in a gentle, almost pleasant voice, and kissed his hair before leaving the room. That night, she lay awake for a very long time, staring at the dark ceiling, and she no longer thought about the wine cellar. She thought about the fact that during their 3 years together, the man's voice had never once changed because of her. She thought about a rusted iron lock, and she began thinking about going down there herself one night, after the house had fallen asleep. The following night, after the 7 courses had become 7 stacks of plates and the chef from Newport had long since driven home, Rosie Holloway stood alone at the sink in the main kitchen, washing dishes in the order she had established during her first year of work, glasses first, plates afterward, pots and pans last, because when the hands were tired, the heaviest things should be the ones that required the least care. Steam from the hot water clouded the window above the sink. The clock on the wall showed 11:40. From the floor above, through 2 layers of flooring and a service staircase, voices drifted down, a woman's voice rising, then falling, then rising again, and a man answering so briefly that Rosie heard only the silence that followed. She understood nothing. She didn't look up. In the place where she had worked for more than a year, people learned very early that some sounds didn't belong to them, and that the safest way to survive inside a large house was to turn their ears into something that worked only when someone called their name. She continued washing. The steam left the skin of her hands flushed, and beneath the fluorescent kitchen lights they could be seen very clearly. Those 2 hands, which she had stopped trying to hide long ago, because hiding them only made people look more closely. The skin from the middle joints of her fingers to her right wrist was a different color, paler and shinier than the rest, stretched into a pattern no artist could have drawn, like the surface of something that had melted, and then hardened again in its own way. The 4 fingers of that hand could never straighten completely. They always curled slightly inward, and after 8 years she had grown so accustomed to it that when she held a glass, a fork, or a pen, she always held it at a slight angle, and no one ever noticed except her. It had happened on a February morning in 2018 at a bakery on Broad Street in Pawtucket, where Rosie worked the early shift for $8.15 an hour. She was 19. The second oven from the left short-circuited at 4:20 in the morning, and flames climbed the wall behind it, and everyone ran outside, and Rosie had made it all the way to the sidewalk, had stood there in the cold with her breath turning white before her face, and then she went back. She didn't go back because she was brave. She went back because it was the only job she had, and if the bakery burned, she would lose it, and she had calculated very quickly in her head, faster than fear, that if the flames reached the gas line, there would be no bakery left to return to. She managed to pull the oven away from the wall. She put out the fire with 2 sacks of flour and a wet blanket. She saved the oven. The following day, the owner dismissed her, and he cried as he told her, truly cried, and said the insurance company's attorney had called, and that if she continued working there, people would ask why a 19-year-old employee had been allowed inside a burning building, and he couldn't afford to answer that question. He gave her an envelope containing $200. Rosie thanked him. She thanked him sincerely, and that was perhaps the worst part of the entire story. In the right pocket of her apron, that night as on every night, there was a wooden spoon. It wasn't the kind of spoon used in a wealthy household, not polished ash wood. Only a cheap spoon sold 3 for $1 at the grocery store, and its handle had worn completely smooth along the left side, worn so deeply that the grain of the wood showed like the growth rings of a very small tree. She didn't use it for cooking there, she only carried it with her. When she finished washing the final stack of pots, Rosie removed her apron, hung it on its hook, and walked into the service hallway, where a row of gray metal lockers had been assigned to the staff. Hers was number 14. She opened it with the key attached to an elastic band around her wrist, and inside there was nothing worth stealing. A spare pair of shoes, a bottle of water, a small box of pain medicine, and a stack of envelopes held together by a rubber band that had stretched loose with age. She took another envelope from her coat pocket, the same kind, unsealed, without an address, bearing only one handwritten line in the lower left corner that no one standing farther than 3 feet away could have read. She placed it on top of the others. She slipped the rubber band back around the stack. She closed the locker and turned the key, then pulled the handle twice out of habit, as she did every night. That locker was the only thing in the world that belonged entirely to her. The apartment where she lived was on the 3rd floor of a building in Olneyville, 2 bedrooms, 3 people, and she shared a room with a woman who worked the morning shift at a plastics factory, and a student she almost never saw. Her bedroom door had no latch. Her car, a 2006 Corolla, had a door lock that had been broken since the previous winter, and she couldn't afford to repair it, so she left it unlocked and never kept anything inside. Only locker number 14, 5 feet 3 inches tall, 12 inches wide, made of gray painted steel, with a lock and a key, was hers, and every night she opened it and locked it again. And no one inside that house, not Marisol, not Barnaby, not the man sitting in the 3rd floor study, slowly turning the ring around his little finger, knew that it contained 101 envelopes. On Sunday morning, Rosie Holloway drove her unlocked Corolla south along Route 117, just as she had every week since June, and she followed the same road, passed the same gas station, turned at the same intersection with the faded billboard, because in Warwick there was only one road leading to the place she needed to go, and she had traveled it for longer than she cared to admit. The pediatric facility stood behind a row of red maples, low and long, built of pale yellow brick, and beside the main entrance was a sign displaying visiting hours that Rosie had memorized long ago: 10 o'clock in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, Saturday and Sunday. She couldn't come on Saturdays. On Saturdays, she worked a double shift at the mansion on the hill, and on Saturday nights she worked the third shift at a late-night diner on Broad Street. The second job no one at the first one knew about, and she slept for 4 hours on Sunday morning in the front seat of the Corolla, parked in the facility lot, waiting for the clock to reach 10. She worked 2 jobs to pay for the room, with a window overlooking that row of maples. That was the entire reason. Not because she was busy, not because she had anything else in the world to do. Patrick Holloway would turn 10 at the end of the following month, and when Rosie entered, he was sitting at the table beside the window, with a box of colored pencils worn blunt, and he looked up and said he had just invented a joke. The joke went like this: "Why did the cow go to music school? Because it wanted to learn moo sick." He began laughing before he had even finished telling it. He laughed the way a 10-year-old child laughed, which meant with his entire body, with both shoulders, and Rosie laughed with him, and her laughter was real. It was always real with him. It was the only part of the week when she didn't have to play any role at all. He said one of the nurses had taught him the joke, and that he had already told it to 4 people, and only 3 of them had laughed, and he was trying to determine what was wrong with the 4th. Then he turned back toward the table and told her he was drawing her. The picture showed a very tall woman, nearly as tall as the entire sheet of paper, wearing a white chef's hat, swollen like a giant mushroom and holding a frying pan, and on that hand Patrick had drawn 6 fingers. Rosie picked up the picture and looked at it for a long time. She asked why there were 6 fingers, and he shrugged and said she needed more fingers because she had to carry so many things. She set the picture down, then bent to retie his shoelaces until her face had returned to normal, and when she stood, she asked whether he had eaten breakfast. He said yes, and said the eggs there were worse than the eggs she made, and Rosie said her eggs were terrible too, and Patrick considered this seriously for 3 seconds before nodding and saying that was true, but they were terrible in a different way. She sat with him for 1 hour and 40 minutes. She read him 2 chapters from a book about pirates. He fell asleep during the 2nd chapter, and she finished reading the page in a voice that grew quieter and quieter until only the sound of turning paper remained, and then she sat silently inside the room while October sunlight fell diagonally through the window, and she watched her little brother sleep, and she didn't think about illness. She thought about 9 years earlier. In August of 2017, 18-year-old Rosalind Holloway entered an administrative building in Providence with $31 in her wallet and signed her name on a document surrendering guardianship of her younger brother, who was barely more than 1 year old. No one forced her. They only explained to her, very kindly and very slowly, that an 18-year-old girl without a home, without steady employment, and without anyone willing to guarantee her, would be unable to raise a baby, and that if she tried, both of them would be sleeping on the street before winter arrived. She believed them. She signed. Then she walked outside, all the way to the grass behind the building, and vomited there, and no one saw her. Patrick was placed with a foster family in Warwick. They were kind people. That was what Rosie checked again and again over the following 4 years, the only thing that kept her alive, that they were kind, that they gave him enough to eat, that they took him to the library on Thursdays, that his foster mother knew he was afraid of thunder, and always left the hallway light on. No one hurt him. No one ever hurt him. But under the terms of the document she had signed with her own hand, Rosie was allowed to see him for only 30 minutes each year, inside a room with a plastic table and a social worker seated in the corner. 30 minutes, every year, for 4 years, and during those 30 minutes she always spoke too quickly, always asked too many questions, and every single time, only after she reached the parking lot did she remember the most important question she had meant to ask. By 2021, When she was 22 and had 2 jobs and a lease bearing her own name, she had gotten him back. Patrick was 5 years old then. He remembered nothing. That was what kind people always told her as a comfort, that the boy wouldn't remember, that he had been too young and they were right. He truly didn't remember. He carried no scar from those 4 years. He grew up and laughed and told terrible jokes and drew his sister with 6 fingers. Only she remembered. She remembered every single month. And now, 9 years later, she was driving down that same road to that same town to visit the same child. And this time it wasn't because she had abandoned him, but because she was keeping him, paying every dollar she had to keep him. And that symmetry was what made it impossible for her to breathe, each time she passed the sign welcoming her to Warwick. His illness was congenital. The doctor had said it 3 times in March, slowly and clearly, that no one had caused it, that it had been inside him since before he could walk. Rosie nodded each time. She understood. She was an adult. She could read. She understood every word, and every night she still lay on the bed inside the room, without a locking door in Olneyville, and calculated it again and again, thinking that if he had spent those 4 years with her, if she hadn't signed, perhaps someone might have discovered it sooner. No one had told her to think that way. On the kitchen table in that apartment sat a stack of bills held together with a blue paper clip, and she didn't need to open them to know the number. And on the refrigerator, fastened with tape, was an older picture drawn in July, also showing his sister in a chef's hat, and also with 6 fingers. The drive home took 70 minutes on Interstate 95. And Rosie always stayed in the far right lane, moving more slowly than everyone else, because when she drove alone after leaving Warwick, she didn't trust her own reflexes. And during those 70 minutes there was nothing to do except watch the median slide past, and let memory choose where it wanted to go. That afternoon, it chose June of 2021. She was 22 years old that day. She wore the only collared shirt she owned, which she had pressed with a kettle of hot water because she didn't own an iron, and she sat inside a room with a plastic table and a window set high near the ceiling, waiting for them to sign the final page. When they brought Patrick in, he was 5 years old, his hair cut short, and he carried a small cloth bag printed with dinosaurs, containing 3 changes of clothes and a stuffed rabbit missing 1 eye. He didn't run to hug her. He only looked at her for a long time, with the serious gaze children have when they are trying to fit a face to a name they have heard only over the telephone. Then he said her hair was longer than it was in the picture. Rosie said, "Yes, I haven't cut it," and he nodded, as though that were a perfectly reasonable answer to the whole of the previous 4 years. At that time, she lived alone in the apartment in Olneyville. She didn't yet share the room with anyone, and she had spent 3 weeks of wages on a bunk bed, even though there was only 1 child, because the salesman told her children liked sleeping on the top bunk, and she wanted him to have something he could like. At 6 o'clock that evening, she cooked their first meal. She had planned that dinner for 2 months. She had imagined it so many times that when she stood at the stove, her hands trembled, and she turned the heat too high, and she stepped away to open the window because the afternoon sun had made the kitchen hot. And during those 30 seconds, the egg noodles burned. Not black. Burned in the worst way, scorched against the bottom of the pan, crisp around the edges, with a smell that rose and couldn't be hidden. Rosie stood looking at the pan and thought about throwing it all away and ordering pizza, and she had already reached for the telephone. She looked down and saw the 5-year-old boy sitting at the table, with both hands resting in his lap, waiting patiently, like a child who had learned very early that when he was inside someone else's home, he had to sit and wait until he was invited. So she served it. She spooned the least burned portion into his bowl and the most burned portion into her own, then sat across from him and apologized. Patrick picked up his fork. He ate everything. He ate every last strand, even the pieces stuck to the bottom, and when the bowl was empty, he set down his fork and looked at his sister with the eyes of someone who had completed a duty. Then he said, "You really are a terrible cook." And Rosie burst out laughing, the sound escaping before she could stop it. And he continued, "But I ate it all." They both laughed. They laughed inside a kitchen that still smelled of burned eggs, beneath a bare round light bulb hanging without a shade, on the 3rd floor of a building whose elevator had been broken since the year before. No one cried. That was what Rosie remembered most clearly, that there had been no tears that evening, Only laughter and the smell of something burned and a child holding out his bowl and asking whether there was any more. After he fell asleep, she washed the dishes. The pan had to soak in hot water for almost an hour, and she washed the wooden spoon she had used to stir those burned noodles. The cheap spoon bought 3 for $1 at the grocery store downstairs, and she dried it with a towel, and she intended to place it inside the drawer with everything else, but she didn't. She set it apart, standing upright inside a jar in front of all the other utensils. She never told anyone why. During the next 5 years, she stirred thousands of meals with that spoon, and its handle slowly wore down along the left side, worn by the way she held it, worn into the shape of her hand that couldn't fully straighten, and she carried it from one apartment to another, tucked it into the pocket of her apron everywhere she worked, and she never threw it away. That night, after she finished washing, Rosie sat at the kitchen table and took out a cheap white card from a pack of 10. She had done this at the end of every month for 4 years, ever since the August when she signed her name on the paper in Providence, and she did it because she didn't know what else to do with the evenings, because there had to be somewhere to set down the month that had just passed, or it would pile onto the month that followed, and she would never be able to stand again. She had never mailed a single one. She had never intended to. She wrote with a half-empty ballpoint pen in small, careful letters, "June. I brought you home today. I thought I would cook for you." Then she placed the card inside an unsealed envelope without a stamp or an address, laid it on top of the old stack of envelopes, and tied the rubber band around them again. She thought it would be the final one. She truly believed that on that night in June of 2021, that now he was there, asleep on the upper bunk 3 meters away from her. She would no longer need to count the months. But at the end of July, she took out another card, and she never stopped. 3 weeks after the night Marisol spread the wine cellar plans across the desk, at 1 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, October 24th, Augustine Ferraro's car stopped outside the mansion on the hill, and he entered through the side door, the servant's entrance, as he always did when he came home late, because the front hall echoed and he hated echoes. His coat was draped over one arm. The right cuff of his shirt was darker than the left, wet from the elbow down, and he had rolled it up twice somewhere on the drive home without remembering when. The air outside smelled of salt and engine oil, the scent the Providence harbor left on a person's clothes for hours after they had gone, and he no longer noticed it. He had stopped noticing it years earlier. He went down to the kitchen for water. That was all he intended to do. But the kitchen lights were still on, and water was running, and when he pushed the swinging door open with his shoulder, a woman stood at the sink with her back to him, rinsing a large pot. She turned. She stepped back half a pace by instinct, then straightened and wiped her hands on her apron. Gus looked at her for 1 second. He didn't recognize her. 14 people worked inside that house, and he knew the faces of 4, and that fact didn't stir anything in him at all, not because he was arrogant, but because it belonged to the order of the world into which he had been born. A world where there were people whose faces one remembered, and people whose faces one had no need to remember. He didn't ask who she was. He asked whether there was anything to eat. Rosie said she could make something quickly, and she said it in the voice of someone who had already calculated that refusing wasn't an option that existed. She went to the refrigerator. Inside there was leftover sea bass, foie gras in a porcelain dish, and 7 paper boxes arranged in a row on the lowest shelf that she had learned during her first month never to touch. She closed the refrigerator. She took out 3 eggs, a handful of dried noodles from a glass jar, an onion, and a piece of butter. Gus sat on the stool at the corner of the kitchen counter, the stool no one had ever seen him use. He said nothing for the next 8 minutes. He watched her hands. They chopped the onion quickly and unevenly, cracked the eggs against the edge of the bowl with a single tap, held the wooden spoon she drew from her apron pocket, and stirred the noodles in the pan with a small, steady circle, slightly off-center. He saw the shiny skin running from her knuckles to her wrist, and he didn't ask. Some men would have asked. Some men would have pointed at it and said what happened, as though their curiosity were a kindness. Gus only watched, took note, and remained silent, because he understood very well that some marks on a person had been made during a morning their owner didn't want to tell again. She placed the bowl of noodles before him. No decoration, nothing sprinkled over the top. Egg noodles fried with onion, steaming in a plain white porcelain bowl normally used by the staff. He looked at it, then he ate. He finished everything. He ate with the same hand whose shirt cuff was still wet. And during those 4 minutes, he didn't think about the spotless plate he had stared at for so long inside a closed restaurant on Atwell's Avenue. He didn't think about the man who had paused at the threshold to fasten the button of his coat that was too thin. He didn't think about anything at all, and that was the first thing that had happened to him in months. Rosie stood 6 feet away with her hands clasped before her apron, and she knew nothing. She thought the master of the house had returned late from work. She thought perhaps he was hungry. She had cooked for a man who had just come home from the harbor using the same recipe she had once made for a 5-year-old boy inside a kitchen that smelled of burned eggs 5 years earlier, and neither of them knew that truth was resting silently on the counter between them. Gus set down his fork. He looked at the empty bowl, exactly as he had looked at an empty plate 4 hours earlier, and something passed across his face and disappeared. He asked her name. She said, "Rosalind, sir." He shook his head very slightly, only once. "No," he said. "What do people call you?" She was silent for 1 beat, because the question didn't feel like a question so much as a door opening slightly, and she wasn't certain she was permitted to step through it. Then she said, "Rosie." Gus nodded. He didn't thank her. He stood, took his coat, and left the kitchen. And in the stone hallway he paused for about 3 seconds before the staircase with one hand resting on the banister, without turning around, then continued upstairs. Rosie washed the bowl. She washed the pan. She dried the wooden spoon with a towel, slipped it back into her apron pocket, and went into the service hallway, and she opened locker number 14. And she looked at the stack of envelopes bound with a rubber band for 1 extra second before closing it, turning the key, and tugging the handle twice. At 7 o'clock the following morning, Barnaby stood before the main kitchen with both hands clasped behind his back, and informed the entire staff that from that day forward, the kitchen lights would remain on throughout the night, and no one was to switch them off, even after the doors had been locked. Someone asked why. Barnaby didn't answer. He merely looked over their heads once, nodded, and walked away. He had served inside that house for 40 years, and he understood very well that some orders came without reasons, and he also knew, though he would never say it aloud to anyone for as long as he lived, that this was how a man like that said thank you. That light would remain burning for the next 29 nights, and on the 30th night, at 3 o'clock in the morning, it would be the only thing guiding him toward a tin box left partly open on the kitchen counter. 6 days later, on the morning of Friday, October 30th, Marisol Vance Drury stood at the top of the service staircase, holding a list printed on thick paper, and she read it aloud to Barnaby in the pleasant voice she used when giving orders. The party was 3 weeks away. There would be 60 guests, a 4-piece orchestra, flowers delivered from Boston that morning, and 300 glasses requiring storage, and the entire eastern basement had to be cleared before the end of the weekend to hold them. She didn't mention the wine cellar once. She hadn't spoken about it for 28 days, and Barnaby, who had spent 40 years reading the silences inside that house, took note and said nothing. Rosie was sent downstairs with 2 other people. They worked throughout the morning, carrying wooden crates filled with old porcelain, picture frames wrapped in cloth, and a wicker baby carriage that no one knew had belonged to whom. And near noon the other 2 were called upstairs to help raise the garden tents, leaving Rosie alone in the long basement hallway with its low ceiling and its smell of lime and wet wood. At the end of the hallway stood a door. She had passed it 4 times that morning without looking, because she had learned not to look during her first month, just as the cleaners before her had learned, treating the forbidden threshold like an unspoken boundary, without anyone ever giving the order. But the list in her hand clearly said the entire eastern basement, and that door stood within the eastern basement, and she remained before it for a long time with the broom in her hand. The iron padlock hanging from the latch was the size of a child's fist, and it had rusted so deeply that the keyway could no longer be seen. Rosie touched it with 1 finger. It fell. It didn't spring open or break apart. It simply dropped from the latch and lay on the concrete floor in 2 pieces, with a fine reddish-brown powder inside its metal core, soft as sand. 23 years was long enough to destroy a lock without anyone's help. She stood there for a very long time. She thought about going upstairs and telling Barnaby. She thought about finishing the hallway, leaving everything as it was, and telling no one. Then she pushed the door, because she had been assigned to clear the entire area, and because something inside her chest told her to push it open. The door led into a room smaller than she had imagined. The air inside didn't smell foul. It was only still, with the stillness of air no one had disturbed in many years. Dust covered everything in a layer as fine as chalk. A long wooden table stood in the middle of the room, a granite sink with a crack along one edge, several empty shelves on the walls, and against the far wall, occupying nearly its entire width, stood a black cast-iron oven with decorative patterns molded into its door, as tall as Rosie's chest, the kind of oven no one had manufactured since the previous century. She placed her hand against it. It was as cold as stone beneath the earth, a cold without a bottom, the cold of metal that had been cold. For so long it no longer remembered that it had once been hot. Someone had cleaned it before locking the room. That was the first thing Rosie understood, and it raised gooseflesh along her arms. No one cleaned an oven and locked it away forever, unless they were doing something very much like holding a funeral. On the wooden table sat a brass scale and a flour sifter, both turned upside down and arranged neatly, like instruments on the tray of a patient who had been discharged. Inside the drawer were 3 wooden spoons and an apron tie. Rosie closed the drawer very gently. She swept that room for 40 minutes, and she didn't sweep the oven. She wiped it with a damp cloth slowly, and she didn't understand why she did it. In the northeastern corner, a large section of wallpaper had peeled away and curled upward like tree bark, and Rosie bent down to pull the rest loose so she could clean beneath it. Someone had already peeled that section back. The edge wasn't torn or crumbled. It had been lifted along a straight line with considerable care, and the baseboard behind it had been pried away and pressed clumsily back into place. She immediately thought of mice. Old houses like this always had mice inside the walls. She had seen them at the bakery in Pawtucket. They chewed paper and dragged things into their nests. And she believed that for exactly 2 seconds before she stopped thinking about it. And 6 weeks later, when she remembered this moment inside a room containing 9 people, she would understand that mice didn't peel wallpaper in straight lines. Behind the loose baseboard was an empty space, and inside that space was a tin box. It was the kind of biscuit tin people gave one another during the holidays, rectangular and painted blue, though most of the paint had flaked away, and its lid had been opened and closed again, because the dust covering the lid didn't align with the dust along the sides. Rosie sat on the concrete floor, placed the box across her knees, and opened it. Inside was a Polaroid photograph, nothing else. No letter, no documents, no other object, only a single photograph resting inside a box many times larger than it needed to be, lying slightly toward one side in the way an object rests when something else once lay beside it and had been removed. The photograph showed a woman with black hair tied back, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, laughing at someone outside the frame. She stood beside the same cast-iron oven that now occupied the room, except the oven in the photograph was open, and there was fire inside it. Pressed close to her side was a boy of about 8 or 9, with hair as black as hers, holding a dish towel in both hands, and he wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking up at her, and on his face was the expression Rosie had seen only once in her life, on the face of a 5-year-old child sitting before a bowl of burned noodles and saying, "But I ate it all." Rosie sat motionless on the cold concrete floor for a very long time. She didn't turn the photograph over. She didn't know why, and later she would never be able to explain it. Perhaps because turning over a photograph was something done by a person who had the right to know, and she didn't. She closed the lid. She lifted the box with both hands, stood, and walked back into the hallway, and she closed the oak door behind her, even though there was no longer any lock with which to secure it. Rosie kept the tin box inside locker number 14 for an entire day and night, and she couldn't sleep. And on the morning of Saturday, October 31st, before the house had awakened, and while white dew still covered the garden tents, she carried the photograph down to the pantry where Barnaby Quill was polishing the silverware, one piece at a time, with a square of felt he had used for many years. She apologized for disturbing him. She said she had found this while cleaning the basement. Then she placed the Polaroid on the wooden table between them, pushed it toward him, and stepped back half a pace, as though she had just set down something that might explode. Barnaby didn't immediately put down the knife in his hand. He finished polishing it, checked the way the light moved across its surface, and only then placed it in the tray in its proper order. After that, he picked up the photograph. He looked at it for a very long time. Rosie stood there and counted 30 seconds, then 40, then stopped counting. Nothing happened on the man's face. His hand didn't tremble. His breathing didn't change. He only looked at the photograph in the way a person looks at a door he has passed through thousands of times and knows exactly what lies behind it. And he placed it on the table with the image facing upward, 2 fingers resting along its upper edge. Her name was Constance Ferraro, he said. His voice was as flat as glass. She was the master's mother. She died in February of 2003, when he was 11 years old. She began cooking in that kitchen when she was 18, and she cooked there until the winter when she could no longer stand. And during all those years, there wasn't a single Saturday when the side door of this house was locked before 9 o'clock at night. He said nothing more about those Saturdays. Rosie didn't ask. After the funeral, he continued, the master's father ordered the basement kitchen sealed. Everything that belonged to her was removed. In this house, from March of that year onward, no one was permitted to speak her name. And the people who did were no longer employed here afterward, and they didn't work anywhere else in this state either. He said that in exactly the same voice he had used when speaking about the silverware. He didn't say who had locked the door. Rosie thought it was a detail omitted because it didn't matter. She would continue thinking so for another 75 days. She looked at the photograph, at the black-haired woman laughing at someone outside the frame, at the fire inside the cast-iron oven. And she asked a question she hadn't prepared, a question that rose from somewhere beneath her awareness, in the same way she had once turned back toward a burning bakery at 4:20 in the morning. She asked what Constance used to cook. Barnaby didn't answer. Outside the window, a bird struck the gutter. He stood there with the piece of felt in his hand, 68 years old, after 40 years of service, and looked down at the hands of the young woman standing before him. The same hands he had seen during an interview 14 months earlier and had never asked about. He had stood inside that basement kitchen for 23 years. He had carried coffee downstairs at 6 in the morning and brought trays upstairs at 10 o'clock at night, and he had stood exactly 3 steps from the cast-iron oven hundreds of times, perhaps thousands, watching a woman sink her hand into a sack of flour, lift it out, and judge the amount by tilting her palm so the flour ran toward the edge. He had watched her do it on damp mornings in April and dry afternoons in September, and she did it differently every time, and she never explained to anyone why. He had never written it down. He had never told anyone that he remembered. In 23 years, not one person in that house, including the man sleeping on the 3rd floor with her ring around his little finger, had ever thought to ask the old steward whether he remembered anything. People didn't ask about things they couldn't see. Barnaby set down the piece of felt. She measured the flour with her hand. He said, not with a cup. She said the cup didn't know whether the day was damp or dry. Rosie looked up. He was still looking at the photograph, not at her. She said the flour knew, he continued. The flour always knew. The cook's only responsibility was not to argue with it. Then he raised his eyes, and for the first time in 14 months, he looked directly into the young woman's face. You have the hands of someone who knows how to cook, he said. Sit down, I'll dictate, and you will write. Rosie didn't understand what was happening. She only pulled out the chair and sat, then took the half-empty ballpoint pen from her apron pocket and a sheet of paper folded into quarters that she normally used for grocery lists, and she placed it on the table and smoothed it flat with the edge of her hand. Barnaby began to speak. He spoke slowly. He spoke about flour and eggs, and how the yolks had to be left out beginning the night before. And he spoke about something Constance called by an Italian name he didn't pronounce quite correctly, even though he had heard it thousands of times. And he spoke about how the oven had to be lit 40 minutes in advance, and its door couldn't be opened even once during the first 20 minutes. And he stopped at one point, only one, when he reached the upper crust, and he remained silent for 5 seconds. Then he continued. Rosie wrote everything down. She wrote in small, careful letters, the same handwriting she had used for 101 cards that would never be sent. And when the page was full, she turned it over and continued writing on the back. He didn't tell her what he was giving her. She didn't ask. And when he finished, he picked up the Polaroid, looked at it for 1 more second, then returned it to her without turning it over. picked up the piece of felt, and resumed polishing the silverware exactly where he had stopped. For the next 6 days, the sheet of paper folded into quarters remained inside Rosie's apron pocket beside the wooden spoon, and every night before she slept, she opened it and read it once, not to memorize it, but because she needed to make certain it was still there, that she hadn't imagined that morning in the pantry, with an old man polishing silverware and speaking about flour as though it were a living creature. By the morning of Friday, November 6th, she went upstairs to the 2nd floor. She had been thinking all week and had reached the only conclusion any ordinary person could reach, that this belonged to the master of the house, that it had been found inside his home, that it had belonged to his mother, and that keeping it inside the apron pocket of a dishwasher was wrong. Something she didn't want to carry for one more day. She held the paper and the Polaroid photograph inside an envelope. The 2nd floor hallway was lined with oak and echoed, and the study door stood partly open, and she could see one corner of the desk, and a hand turning the ring around a little finger. She had raised her hand to knock when Barnaby Quill appeared on her left without making a sound, the way longtime stewards moved through the houses they served, and he placed 2 fingers very lightly against her wrist and shook his head. He led her down the service stairs, walking ahead without looking back, and only when they were standing in the basement hallway, about 10 steps from the oak door that no longer had a lock, did he speak. "What are you planning to give him?" he asked. Rosie opened the envelope and showed him the paper. Barnaby looked at it, then at her, and there was something on his face that resembled exhaustion without being quite the same. "If you give him a piece of paper," he said, "he will take it, thank you, carry it into his study, open the safe, and place it inside with the other documents. Then he will close the safe, and he will never open it again. Not next year, not 10 years from now. Never," he paused. "That is how people bury what they fear. They don't burn it. They place it somewhere perfectly safe, and tell themselves they can take it out whenever they choose, and then they live the rest of their lives without ever doing so. I have watched that happen once before inside this house, with things far more important than a sheet of paper." Rosie asked what she was supposed to do. Barnaby looked at her hands. "You are a cook, miss," he said. "Don't give him the paper. Give him what is written on it." Then he turned and climbed the stairs without saying another word, and he didn't offer to help her, didn't say he would stand beside her, didn't say that if anything happened, he would accept his share of the responsibility. He was the only person in the world who still remembered that recipe. He had carried it inside his mind for 23 years, and he had just given it to a 27-year-old woman and walked away upstairs, and both of them knew who would be standing inside that room when the forbidden name was spoken aloud. Rosie remained alone in the basement hallway for a long time. The following morning, she counted her money. There were $40 in her wallet, and a $2 bill she had kept for years out of superstition. On the kitchen table in Olneyville, beneath the blue paper clip, was a stack of bills she had planned to pay in part that weekend. She sat looking at those 2 things for 15 minutes. Then she put on her coat and walked to the market. Good butter, the kind with the high-fat content specified on the paper. 12 free-range eggs, slowly milled flour that required her to walk another 2 kilometers to find. Lemon peel, almonds, and a small bag of sugar. She paid $41.85, handed over the $2 bill as well, and the cashier returned 15 cents. She baked the first one on Monday night, in her own kitchen after the 3rd shift at the diner on Broad Street, when it was already 2 o'clock in the morning. It burned on the bottom and remained raw in the center. She sat looking at it on the table until morning, then wrapped it in newspaper and carried it down to the trash. The 2nd attempt was on Wednesday night. This time it didn't burn, but the center collapsed the moment she opened the oven door, sinking like something that had lost all hope. And Rosie stood there, holding the oven cloth, and said aloud inside the empty kitchen that she was sorry, and she didn't know whom she was apologizing to. She had enough ingredients left for exactly one more attempt. The 3rd was Thursday night. She did everything exactly as she had done the previous 2 times, except for one thing. She didn't measure the flour with a cup. She plunged her hand into the sack of flour, the hand whose 4 fingers could never fully straighten, and she lifted it out and tilted her palm so the flour flowed toward the edge, and she felt the damp November night against her skin, and she left a little behind, only a little. exactly as a 68-year-old man had described in a flat voice inside the pantry. When she took it from the oven, she didn't taste it. She didn't cut one corner to check. She only stood about half a meter from the tray, and she knew. She knew in the way people know when a door has finally agreed to open, not because they hear the hinges, but because the air inside the room has changed direction. She stood that way for a very long time with both hands hanging at her sides, and the only thing she thought about, the first and only thing, was that her brother would turn 10 on the 21st. On the morning of Saturday, November 7th, she submitted a request to take off the evening shift on Friday, November 20th. The manager looked at the calendar, saw that it was an ordinary Friday night with no party and no guests, stamped his approval, and placed the form in the paper tray on his desk. It remained there for 13 days. On the afternoon of Tuesday, November 17th, an editor from a Boston magazine called Marisol Vance Drury and said the photographer was available only on Saturday and Sunday, that the morning light on the eastern front of the house would be most beautiful at around 9 o'clock, and that if the house had hosted a party the night before, there would be tents, flower delivery trucks, and 40 crates of empty glasses stacked near the entrance, and all of those things would ruin the photographs. Marisol listened for 4 minutes. She didn't think of anyone at all when she said, "That is fine. We will move it to Friday." She didn't think of anyone because there was no one for her to think about. That was the whole problem, and it was also the reason no one in that house could call what she did cruel. She hung up, called the event planner, called the florist, called the 4-piece orchestra, and within 1 hour the entire party had been moved back by 24 hours, neatly and without a sound. Barnaby received the notice at 6 o'clock that evening. He stood before the staff schedule posted on the pantry wall, picked up a pencil, and revised the working hours of 14 people. Every approved request for leave on the evening of Friday, November 20th, was cancelled. He wrote the word cancelled in very faint pencil, almost too light to see, then set the pencil down and stared at the board for 30 seconds before turning away. Rosie Holloway's request for that evening off had rested in the paper tray on the manager's desk for 13 days, stamped approved, the ink completely dry. No one thought to remove it. They had simply changed the date of the party, and the paper remained in the tray, valid and meaningless, and it was still there 3 months later. Rosie learned about the change on Tuesday evening. She stood before the schedule and read her name 3 times, and she looked at the faint penciled word cancelled, and she said nothing. She stepped into the service hallway and called the pediatric facility in Warwick from her telephone, and she spoke with the nurse on duty, the woman with whom she had exchanged messages for 5 months, and asked whether there was any way to change the visiting time. The nurse checked the schedule. Saturday was full. There were 3 consultation sessions and a routine examination, and no opening remained for an unscheduled visit. But Friday evening would work, she said. "I am on duty Friday night. I will ask permission for 1 hour, from 8 until 9, and I will tell the boy you are coming." Rosie thanked her. She thanked her twice, ended the call, and stood with her back against the row of gray metal lockers for a long time, then returned to the kitchen and continued working, because the party was 3 days away and 60 people were coming. On Thursday night, November 19th, after the 3rd shift at the diner on Broad Street, Rosie returned to the apartment in Olneyville and baked 2 cakes. She had planned enough ingredients for 2 for that week. She had made that calculation on the very night. She stood before the tray in her kitchen and knew she had succeeded. The first cake was large, 9.5 inches across, and she made it with great care, and it was intended for a man she had cooked for exactly once, at 1 o'clock in the morning, a man who hadn't thanked her. The second was small, no larger than 2 cupped hands, and she spent longer making it than the first. She would take it to Warwick on Saturday morning. Her brother would turn 10 on November 21st, and in the 5 years they had lived together, she had never once had enough money to buy him a real birthday cake. She placed it inside an old tin box that she had washed and dried, cut a small piece of paper, wrote on it with the half-empty ballpoint pen, and taped it to the lid. 3 characters, 2 letters, another period, and a number. She placed the larger cake inside a cardboard box she had asked for at the diner, and because she had no ribbon, she tied it with the string used to close bread bags. On the afternoon of Friday, November 20th, 60 cars slowly made their way up the steep road leading to the mansion on the hill. The tents had already been raised in the garden. The four-piece orchestra played the kind of music no one listened to. Inside the ballroom, a long table covered in white cloth stood against the southern wall, and gifts were placed upon it, and not one gift on that table had cost less than $3,000, except one. At 6:15, Rosie walked through the service hallway carrying the cardboard box, and she placed it in the corner of the table, in the least visible place, behind a large package wrapped in silver paper that was 4 times its size. She had intended to do it quickly and return to the kitchen. Marisol Vance Drury stood 7 steps away with a glass of wine in her hand, speaking to the wife of a judge. She saw it. She didn't stop speaking. She continued nodding, continued smiling, continued telling her story about the house in Nantucket, but her eyes had left the woman before her and settled on the cardboard box tied with bread string, and she looked at it longer than necessary, far longer, so long that the judge's wife had to turn her head to see what Marisol was staring at. By 8:40 that evening, when the four-piece orchestra had just finished one song and hadn't yet begun the next, Marisol Vance Drury set her wineglass onto the tray of a passing waiter and walked toward the long table covered in white cloth against the southern wall. She had been waiting for this moment for 2 hours. During those 2 hours she had laughed, shaken hands, kissed 27 women on the cheek, and looked back at the cardboard box exactly 11 times. And each time it had remained there, partly hidden behind the package wrapped in silver paper, tied with a dirty white string she immediately recognized as the kind used to twist shut industrial bread bags. She lifted it with 2 fingers, held it at chest height, turned toward the room, and spoke in the clear voice shaped by 20 years of lessons in how to speak. "Has someone brought leftovers to my celebration?" Laughter rose from the corner near the windows. 1 short laugh, then 2 more, and then the whole room settled into the silence of people waiting to see what would happen next. Marisol placed the box on the table, untied the string, and opened the lid. She looked inside longer than anyone needed to look at a cake. Then she raised her head and asked who had brought it. No one answered. She asked again, more slowly, and this time she looked toward the doorway leading into the service corridor, where 3 people in black uniforms stood holding empty trays. And she said that no one here was ashamed of their gift, were they? So whoever had brought it should step forward and claim it. Rosie Holloway stepped out of the shadow of the doorway. She crossed 7 steps of marble and stopped about 5 feet from Marisol, still holding the silver tray against her stomach with both hands, and said, "Yes, Mom. It was mine." 60 people turned to look. Someone set a glass down on a glass table, and the sound carried with perfect clarity. Marisol tilted her head, smiled, and said it was touching, truly a touching gesture, and that she would be the first to taste it, because no one would ever be allowed to say that this house looked down upon another person's sincerity. A porcelain plate was brought to her, a knife. She cut a small piece, placed it on the plate, and lifted the fork with the solemnity of someone about to perform a ceremony whose script she had written herself. She put the cake into her mouth, and during the next half-second, something happened on Marisol Vance Drury's face that not one of those 60 people saw, because all of them were watching the fork instead of her eyes. It wasn't disgust. It was the opposite. It was the expression of someone who had stepped into a dark room and touched a piece of furniture that couldn't possibly still be there. Something she herself had hidden one night in October, beneath a stack of bills inside the drawer of her dressing table. The taste touched her tongue, and she knew immediately. She knew before she had time to think. There was flour, butter, lemon peel, and something else. Something she had read on a yellowed page, written in the misspelled handwriting of a woman who had learned to spell from her own son. Something she had read by flashlight at 2 o'clock in the morning inside a basement room, before closing the notebook, carrying it upstairs, intending to burn it, and failing to do so. In that half-second, Marisol understood that what lay inside her drawer was no longer the only thing of its kind left in the world. Fear came before anger. It came very quickly, traveled up her spine and reached the back of her neck, and her hand reacted before her mind could give the order. She spat the cake onto the porcelain plate. The sound carried through the silent room, small, wet, and perfectly distinct. Someone drew in a breath. Marisol set down the fork, lifted the plate, and held it in both hands as though she were carrying something dead, then tipped it. The cake slid over the edge and fell face down onto the marble floor, and it didn't break apart but flattened slowly, like something surrendering. Then she stepped forward once, placed the heel of her shoe on it, and pressed down. Another sound came from beneath it, dry and brief, the sound of wood splitting. The wooden spoon had slipped from Rosie's apron pocket as she crossed those 7 steps of marble, and it had been lying there all along, unseen by everyone, including the woman who had stepped on it. It broke into 2 unequal pieces, the fracture running exactly through the place where the handle had worn away toward the left, after 5 years and thousands of meals. Marisol lifted her foot. She looked down at the mess on the floor, then looked up at the young woman standing 5 feet away. "Clean it," she said. "That is what you were born to do, isn't it?" Rosie set the silver tray on the table. She knelt. She didn't say a word, didn't lift her eyes, and she pulled a folded white cloth napkin from the table and spread it across the marble, then began to gather everything. That hand collected every crumb into the center of the cloth. That hand picked up the 2 broken pieces of wood and placed them beside each other in the proper direction, as though placing them correctly still meant something. That hand wiped the smear of butter from the stone with 1 clean corner of the napkin. She worked for 2 minutes and 10 seconds. 60 people stood inside that room, and not one stepped forward. Some turned away. Some raised their glasses and took very small sips. One young man looked down at his own feet and remained that way until it was over, and 30 years later he would still remember the tips of his shoes that night. The orchestra began the next song. Someone laughed. Inside the study in the western wing, 3 walls and 1 hallway away, Augustine Ferraro held a telephone to his ear and told someone at the harbor that the shipment would arrive on Tuesday, and he heard nothing, and he wouldn't hear anything for another 6 hours. Barnaby Quill stood motionless in the doorway leading to the service corridor, his hands clasped before his stomach, watching the young woman kneeling on the marble floor, and he didn't move. 40 years. He opened his mouth and spoke 1 sentence, so softly that not one of the other 60 people heard it, so softly that even he wasn't certain whether he had spoken aloud or only thought it. The former mistress of this house once worked in the kitchen too. Then he closed his mouth, remained standing where he was, and didn't step forward. 22 miles to the south, in Warwick, that same evening, a boy sat beside a second-floor window with a paper hat on his head. He had made it the afternoon before from 2 sheets of drawing paper, 1 roll of clear tape, and 7 stars cut from yellow paper, all of them pasted on crooked, and the nurse named Deirdre had asked why they were crooked, and he had said because the stars in the sky weren't lined up either. His birthday was the following day. But his sister was coming that night. He had known for 3 days, and a boy who was almost 10 didn't wait for the exact day before wearing his hat. Deirdre had worked the Friday evening shift for the past 5 months, and she was the one who texted Rosie's Holloway every Sunday night to say that the boy had finished his dinner, that he had laughed when they reached the chapter with the whale, that he had asked when it would snow. She was the one who had arranged an extra hour of visiting time that evening. She had asked 3 different people before receiving permission, and she was the one who had told Patrick with her own mouth that his sister would arrive at 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock came. He sat beside the window with his legs swinging above the floor, looking down at the parking lot where yellow light shone across the puddles left by the afternoon rain. He had prepared 2 jokes. He had practiced the second one with Deirdre at 7, and she had laughed even though she had heard it 3 times that day. On the table beside the bed was a sheet of paper folded in half, containing a picture he had spent the whole week drawing, and he hadn't shown it to anyone, not even Deirdre, because he said it was a present. At 8:20, he turned and asked her what time it was. She said 8:20. He nodded and said his sister was probably stuck in traffic on Interstate 95, and he said it with the authority of someone who had listened to his sister complain about Interstate 95 for 5 years. He turned back toward the window. A silver car pulled into the parking lot and he sat up straighter, but the person who stepped out was a man carrying flowers, and Patrick leaned back against the chair and said, "Oh," then told Deirdre that his sister drove an old blue car whose passenger door wouldn't lock. At 9 o'clock, Deirdre brought him a cup of warm milk and sat in the chair across from him, and she said perhaps his sister had been asked to work late that night. He said yes, his sister worked in 2 places. He didn't say it like a complaint, but like a fact worthy of pride, the way children spoke about the work done by adults they loved. He said his sister cooked in a very large house on a hill, and that once she had told him it had 14 bathrooms, and he asked Deirdre why anyone needed 14 bathrooms, and Deirdre said she didn't know either, and they both laughed. At 9:40, he asked what time it was. She said 9:40. He said all right, then adjusted the paper hat, because it had slipped toward the back of his head, pressing it down carefully with both hands so he wouldn't tear the taped place. Deirdre took out her telephone and sent Rosie a second message. She had sent the first at 8:15. Neither had been read. She called twice. Both calls rang until they went to voicemail, and she left no message, because she had done this work for 11 years, and knew that mothers and sisters never failed to answer unless they couldn't. At 10 o'clock, Deirdre told him it was getting late. Patrick said he wasn't tired. She sat beside him and they played a card game whose rules he invented, and he won again, and Deirdre allowed him to win a third time. At 10:20, he yawned and pretended he hadn't. At 10:40, he asked what time it was for the third time that evening. Deirdre said it was almost 11. He sat quietly for a moment, looking out the window at the parking lot, which was nearly empty now, the yellow lights shining on the wet pavement. Then he turned toward her and said, "She must be very tired." He said it softly, without adding anything else, and then he asked whether his sister would come tomorrow. And Deirdre said yes, she promised his sister would come tomorrow. He nodded and climbed into bed. He placed the folded sheet of paper with the drawing inside it, neatly in the center of the bedside table, so it would be the first thing anyone saw upon entering the room. He lay down, still wearing the paper hat. Deirdre pulled the blanket over him and asked whether he wanted to take it off, and Patrick said no, he would wear it until tomorrow, and he said it with his eyes already half closed. She remained in the chair beside his bed. She sat there for 20 minutes, until his breathing became even, until his hand loosened its grip on the edge of the blanket. The paper hat had tilted to one side, one of the 7 yellow stars had folded along its edge, and one corner of tape had come loose and caught in his hair. Deirdre reached out to remove it. She stopped halfway. Then she withdrew her hand, switched off the bedside lamp, and sat there a little longer in the darkness of the room where the sunlight had faded long ago, beside a sleeping boy with 7 crooked yellow stars upon his head. The final guest left at 11:15, and during the 40 minutes that followed, the house on the hill became empty, in the way only large houses could become empty, with glasses bearing lipstick marks along their rims arranged in rows on glass tables, with the scent of perfume still suspended in the ballroom air, with the 4-piece orchestra loosening the strings of their instruments, while no one spoke to anyone else. Rosie Holloway finished washing the last batch of glasses at 11:15. She removed her apron, hung it on its hook, then stood looking at that hook for a while. Then she took the apron down and tied it around her waist again. She opened the refrigerator and took out the butter. She opened the glass jar on the high shelf and scooped out flour. She placed 3 eggs on the counter, and she stood there with both hands braced against the edge of the steel table, looking at them for about a minute. Then she began. There was no one in the kitchen, no voices, only the sound of the oven being turned on and the gas catching flame, the quiet sigh every oven made when it began to warm. That hand struck the first egg against the rim of the bowl with a single tap and separated the shell with its thumb. That hand cracked the second. That hand separated the yolks from the whites by passing them back and forth between the 2 halves of shell, doing it slowly, without breaking a single yolk. It cut the butter into cubes on the wooden board. It dipped into the sack of flour, lifted out, tilted the palm so the flour ran toward the edge, and stopped at exactly the right moment, and there was no one in the kitchen to witness that it had stopped at exactly the right moment. It grated the lemon peel. It mixed. It kneaded. That hand performed all the same movements it had performed 2 hours and 10 minutes earlier on the marble floor of a room filled with 60 people, when it gathered every crumb into the center of a white cloth napkin. There was a moment, when she reached for the spoon to stir, when her hand touched the empty pocket of her apron. She stopped for half a second. Then she took a wooden ladle from the kitchen drawer, the polished ash kind used in that house, and stirred with it, and she didn't look down. The tray went into the oven at 11:58, 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, Rosie sat on the stool at the corner of the counter. The stool no one had ever seen the master of the house use except on one night 4 weeks earlier. And she didn't move, and she didn't take out her telephone, because her telephone was inside locker number 14 in the service hallway, where it had remained since 6 o'clock that evening, as it did during every shift, according to the rules of the house. She removed the cake at 12:38. She didn't taste it. She placed it on a wire rack and stood there watching it cool, and the scent rose and clung to the walls, the curtains, and her hair. The scent a black-haired woman had left behind inside a basement kitchen for 19 years before someone locked the door. At 1 o'clock in the morning, she walked into the service hallway. She opened locker number 14 with the key attached to the elastic band around her wrist. Her telephone lay on top of the spare shoes, and the screen lit when she touched it. 3 missed calls. 8:18, 9:02, 10:31, and 1 message sent at 10:47, from Deirdre, he is still waiting. Rosie read those 4 words. She read them again. She leaned her back against the row of metal lockers and slid down slowly until she was sitting on the tiled floor of the service hallway with both knees drawn up and the telephone still glowing in her palm. She didn't cry aloud. She made no sound at all. The whole building was silent, and she was the quietest part of it. She sat that way for 17 minutes. The cake crushed beneath a heel hadn't done this to her. The wooden spoon broken into 2 pieces hadn't either. 60 people watching her kneel on the marble floor hadn't done it. Only 4 words, typed with a thumb by a woman who had promised a 10-year-old boy that his sister would come. At 1:17, Rosie stood. She took a white card from the locker, the cheapest kind, bought in packs of 10, and the half-empty ballpoint pen. She placed the card on top of the locker and wrote while standing, in small, careful letters, without crossing anything out. November, I am sorry. I will bring the cake tomorrow morning. She folded it, placed it inside an unsealed envelope without a stamp or address, loosened the rubber band stretched by age, and laid the envelope on top of the stack. 102. 9 years and 3 months since an August afternoon, inside an administrative building in Providence, excluding the months when she had written a card, and then torn it apart because she couldn't bear to read it again. She replaced the rubber band. She closed the locker. She turned the key and pulled the handle twice out of habit as she did every night. She would never open it again. At 1:20, Rosie put on her coat. She returned to the kitchen one final time to turn off the oven and check the gas valve. The small cake had cooled completely. She placed it inside the tin box she had washed and dried the night before and pressed down the lid, but it wouldn't close fully because the rim had been dented long ago, and she pressed it once more before giving up. On the lid was the small piece of paper she had taped there, 3 characters written in ballpoint pen. She left it on the counter beside the sink, where she would see it immediately when she returned at 6 o'clock in the morning to take it with her to Warwick. Beside the box, still unswept because no one had bothered, lay the 2 broken pieces of wood she had placed there at 11 o'clock and hadn't found the courage to throw away. She looked at both things once. Then she switched off the counter light and walked toward the side door. The large light in the center of the kitchen remained burning, as it had for the previous 29 nights, because an order without explanation had been given one morning near the end of October, and no one was permitted to turn it off. Augustine Ferraro had never been able to sleep on the night of his birthday, and he had never asked himself why, because there were truths people lived beside for so long, that they eventually stopped demanding an explanation. At 3 o'clock in the morning on November 21st, he lay in the darkness of the 3rd-floor bedroom, listening to the heating pipes hiss inside the walls, then rose from the bed, put on his robe, and descended the service staircase, because he wanted a glass of water and didn't want to wake anyone. The house was completely dark. Only a strip of yellow light spilled from beneath the swinging door leading into the kitchen, the light he himself had ordered never to be switched off, an order he had given one morning near the end of October, and explained to no one, not even himself. He pushed the door open with his shoulder. It was cold inside. The oven had been turned off hours earlier, and the November chill had seeped through the window above the sink and settled over the steel surfaces of the tables. The counter was cold. The refrigerator handle was cold. The tiled floor beneath his bare feet was so cold that his toes curled instinctively. Everything inside that room had gone cold long ago. Only the scent was still alive. It reached him before he completed his 2nd step, before his eyes could find the switch, before he could even think of a name for it. It wasn't the smell of food. It was the smell of a Saturday morning, the smell of a narrow staircase descending into a basement, the smell of the moment when a 9-year-old boy stood on the 4th step from the bottom and knew that if he went all the way down, a woman would turn and speak his name. Gus stood frozen in the middle of his own kitchen. He was the legal owner of every tile beneath his feet, of the harbor 4 kilometers away, of half the concrete poured into that city during the past 18 years, and he stood there holding an empty water glass, stopped by something he couldn't buy, couldn't shoot, couldn't send to the harbor. On the counter beside the sink was an old tin box with most of its paint worn away, its lid unable to close fully because the rim was dented. Beside it, still lying there, because no one had bothered to sweep them away, were 2 broken pieces of wood placed next to each other in the proper direction, the fracture running through the place where the handle had worn down toward one side. He opened the lid. Inside was a small cake, no larger than 2 cupped hands, completely cold. He looked at it for a very long time. Then he reached inside and broke off a piece with his own fingers, without taking a knife or plate, and raised it to his mouth while standing there in the cold kitchen, beneath the light he had ordered to remain burning. He chewed once. Then he stopped chewing. The empty water glass in his left hand was placed very gently on the counter, carefully, as though the sound might damage something. Then Augustine Ferraro, 34 years old, sat down on the tiled floor of his own kitchen, with his back against the lower cabinet and his knees drawn up, and he remained there in the shadow beneath the counter with a piece of cake still in his hand. He tried to remember the name of the man from the restaurant on Atwell's Avenue. It had happened only 29 days earlier. He had sat across from him for 40 minutes, poured wine for him, watched him wipe his plate with the final piece of bread. He tried to remember, and he couldn't. The name had left him completely, cleanly, as though it had never existed. But he remembered the plate. He remembered with perfect clarity the spotless white plate without a single strand of pasta remaining, remembered the way the man had placed his fork parallel to the knife, and remembered his own voice speaking that sentence inside the room, filled with yellow light, very softly and very calmly, saying that his mother never allowed anyone to die hungry. How many times had he spoken those words in 18 years? He hadn't counted. No one had counted. They had become a ritual, a seal, a prayer he placed at the end of everything he did so that it could be endured, and every time he said them, he believed he was honoring a woman who had died. Inside the pocket of his robe was something he had carried from the study for several weeks, without knowing what to do with it. Barnaby had placed it on his desk one afternoon early that month without saying anything, and Gus had picked it up, looked at it once, slipped it into his pocket and forgotten it there. Now he took it out, the Polaroid. The black-haired woman with her hair tied back, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, laughing at someone outside the frame, the cast-iron oven standing open with fire inside it, and a 9-year-old boy pressed close to her side, holding a dish towel in both hands, not looking at the camera, but looking up at her. He had looked at the photograph 3 times during the past 3 weeks, and had never once turned it over. He turned it over. On the back, written in faded blue ink in the slanted handwriting of a woman who had learned to write late in life, were 3 short sentences. Sabato, sempre sabato, chiunque abbia fame. Saturday, always Saturday, whoever is hungry. Gus read them. Then he turned the photograph over again and looked at it once more. And this time he looked at the entire image instead of only the 2 people in the center. In the left corner, blurred, and almost cut away by the edge of the frame, with only one shoulder and one hand remaining visible, there was another boy holding a plate. It wasn't him. It was some child from the neighborhood, a child he didn't remember, a child who had entered that basement kitchen on some Saturday morning and stood waiting for his turn. And during the next 2 seconds, sitting on the cold tiled floor of the kitchen inside the house, his father had built with money taken from people who never came home, Augustine Ferraro understood what he had misunderstood for 23 years. His mother had never baked that cake only for him. She had baked it every Saturday for anyone who was hungry. The side door of that house had never been locked before 9 o'clock on any Saturday for 19 years, and an old steward had said that to a dishwasher in a flat voice, and she hadn't understood, and Gus had lived inside that house throughout his childhood and hadn't understood either. His mother hadn't taught him that food was a mercy granted before someone was killed. She had taught him that hungry people should be fed. That was everything she had taught. And he had taken those words, taken her name, taken her face in that photograph, and turned them into something he said while rising to put on his coat inside a closed restaurant. He had used her, for 18 years. He had used the woman who had fed an entire neighborhood as an excuse not to look into the faces of the people he sent to the harbor, and he had succeeded so completely that now he remembered their plates but couldn't remember their names. That was when he cried. Not because he remembered his mother. He cried without making a sound, without his shoulders shaking, only water flowing from his open eyes and down his face, and he sat motionless on the tiled floor with both hands resting on his knees, one still holding the unfinished piece of cake. No one anywhere in the house heard anything. Above him, on the counter, the tin box remained open. Taped to its lid was a small piece of paper bearing small, careful writing made with a ballpoint pen that had only half its ink left. Gus raised his eyes and looked at it. 2 letters, 1 dash, 1 number. He stared at it for a very long time, beneath the yellow kitchen light at 3:20 in the morning on November 21st, and he didn't understand what it meant. At 8:30 in the morning, exactly 12 hours after a heel came down on the marble floor, there were 9 people inside the ballroom of the mansion on the hill. The curtains hadn't been fully opened. No one had yet cleared away the 30 remaining glasses from the glass tables. Marisol Vance Drury sat at one end of the velvet sofa with a cup of coffee in her hand, wearing a silk morning robe, her hair not yet pinned up. Hal Dunbridge stood beside the window. Barnaby Quill stood in the doorway leading to the service corridor, his hands clasped before his stomach. 2 of Gus's men stood at opposite ends of the room, and neither of them looked anywhere in particular. A federal judge named Whitcomb and his wife, the final 2 guests who had stayed overnight because of the wine, sat in the corner with untouched breakfasts before them, and they would remember that morning for the remaining 20 years of their lives. And Rosie Holloway stood 3 steps from the kitchen door, her apron tied around her waist, her hands still wet, because she had been summoned while washing the glasses from the previous night. She had arrived in the kitchen at 6 o'clock that morning to collect the tin box. It was no longer on the counter. Augustine Ferraro entered at 8:30. He was fully dressed, clean-shaven, and no one could tell whether he had slept. He placed something on the long table covered in white cloth, where the gifts still sat unopened, and it was the old tin box with its paint worn away, and its lid unable to close fully. Then he stood there with both hands hanging at his sides and looked toward the velvet sofa. He didn't raise his voice. He had never raised his voice in his life. "Who gave you permission to touch my gift?" he said. The sentence was spoken so softly that the man standing near the door had to lean forward, and the judge's wife set down her fork without making a sound. Marisol looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she laughed. It wasn't a false laugh. She truly laughed, and inside that sound something broke, something that had cracked 3 years earlier and had finally reached the bottom. "Do you think I mistook the taste?" she said. She placed the coffee cup on the table, stood, and walked out of the room. No one stopped her. They heard her heels climbing the oak staircase, then silence, then the sound of those heels descending again. She returned carrying something in her hand and threw it onto the table covered in white cloth between the packages wrapped in silver paper, and it slid a short distance before stopping. A notebook. Its cloth cover was faded, its corners worn, and it was about as thick as one joint of a finger. Gus didn't move. Inside the room, the heating pipes hissed within the walls. "You want it?" Marisol said. "Take it. I kept it for 6 weeks, and you didn't notice a thing," she continued, and her voice didn't grow louder. It only became very clear, with the clarity of someone finally speaking aloud the words she had rehearsed thousands of times inside her head. "The night you told me no, I went down there alone at 2 o'clock in the morning with a flashlight. I wanted to know what was behind that door that mattered more than I did. I found it behind the baseboard. I carried it upstairs. I sat in my dressing room and read it, page by page, and I read the handwriting of a woman who learned how to spell from her own son, and I knew at that moment that if you ever held this notebook in your hands, you would never need me again." She stopped. "I intended to burn it," she said. "I had already lit the match. I sat there for 15 minutes and couldn't do it. Do you know why? Not because of conscience. I have never possessed such a thing, and you know that, and that is why you chose me. I couldn't burn it because I am a daughter of the Vance Drury family, and we don't destroy valuable things. We put them away." She looked down at her hands. "It was in the drawer of my dressing table," she said. beneath the bills. For 6 weeks. Every morning I sat before that mirror and put on my makeup, and underneath me, 12 inches from my knees, was your mother. No one in the room said anything. The judge's wife raised one hand to her mouth. I have lived in this house for 3 years, Marisol said, and the only love you have managed to preserve belongs to a woman who died 23 years ago. I didn't kill her, Augustine. I simply refused to give up my place. And last night, I lifted that fork to my mouth and tasted her, inside my room, in the middle of my celebration, brought in by a dishwasher. Do you think I spat it out because I despised it? I spat it out because I was afraid of it. Gus walked to the table. He picked up the notebook. He opened it, and the yellowed pages thickened beneath his fingers, and he turned to the final page, where there was one line written in a language that wasn't English. He read it aloud. His voice remained steady until the 4th word. Solo per il mio Agostino. He stumbled over the name. He stopped for one beat, then finished, Saha fame Saha paura. Then he closed the notebook and held it in his hand. He didn't ask Rosie Holloway where she had found the recipe. He didn't turn toward her even once. He raised his eyes and looked toward the doorway leading into the service corridor, where a 68-year-old man stood, with both hands clasped before his stomach. And he looked at him for 4 seconds, and Barnaby Quill didn't lift his head. He stared down at the carpet. He had stared down at carpets for 40 years, and he had no intention of changing that morning. Gus turned back. He walked to Marisol and took her left hand very gently, in the way one might take someone's hand to lead them across a street. She didn't pull away. He removed the ring from her 4th finger, turning it once and sliding it free, and she allowed him to do it with her eyes open and unblinking. He walked to the gift table, to the packages wrapped in silver paper, and the 3 watches inside leather cases, and placed the ring among them, beside the old tin box with its peeling paint. This is a gift too, he said. You may take it home with you. Marisol stood motionless. She looked at her left hand, at the pale band of skin where the ring had rested for 3 years, and she didn't cry, and perhaps that was what made the judge's wife turn her face away. Then she walked out of the room. She said nothing else. She climbed the stairs, and everyone inside the room heard every single step. The doorway leading to the service corridor, Rosie Holloway had stood motionless throughout the previous 8 minutes, her hands still wet, and she hadn't spoken a word. No one looked at her. Not one of the 9 people asked when she had baked that cake, or with what money, or why there had been 2. She looked at the tin box resting on the table covered in white cloth, its lid open, and at the small piece of paper taped to it that she had written herself with a half-empty ballpoint pen. The clock on the ballroom wall showed 8:38 in the morning, on November 21st. Her little brother had been awake for 2 hours. At 9:10 in the morning, when the federal judge and his wife had reached the driveway and were waiting for their driver, Hal Dunbridge placed one hand on Augustine Ferraro's elbow and guided him into the western hallway, where a tall window overlooked the garden tents still standing from the night before. He closed the door behind them. He was 62 years old, and he had walked behind the men of the Ferraro family for 36 years. And during those 36 years, he had never once touched a Ferraro without permission, and he had just done so, and both men understood what that meant. You ended your engagement to the daughter of the Vance Drury family, Hal said, inside your own ballroom, at 8:30 in the morning, in front of a federal judge and his wife. Gus stood looking out the window. You did it because of a cake, Hal said. Because of a cake, Gus replied. He didn't say it as a confession. He said it the way someone confirmed an address. Hal remained still for 3 seconds. Theodore Vance Drury has practiced law in Boston for 41 years, he said. He sits on the boards of 2 hospitals and a law school. He has 3 federal judges dine at his home every Christmas, and you have just given a 4th one a story he will repeat at every one of those dinners for the next 20 years. You didn't shoot anyone, Augustine. You did something worse. You allowed them to see that you are a man who can be hurt. Gus continued looking out the window. Then let them judge me, he said. Hal looked at him for a very long time. There was one moment, only one, when he nearly said something else, something that didn't belong to his work, something about the funeral in 2008 and a 16-year-old boy, whose hands shook so badly that he couldn't tie his own necktie. He didn't say it. He had never spoken sentences like that. He only nodded once, opened the door, and left. Inside his first-floor office, Hal Dunbridge sat down, took the small leather-bound notebook from his inner pocket, and opened it to the next page. He had written in notebooks like that for 36 years, and no one had ever read them, including the man he served. There were no names inside, no dates, only symbols he had invented when he was 26, a compact little system of dots and abbreviated letters, enough for him alone to understand and useless to any prosecutor in the world. He wrote 2 lines. Then he sat motionless for a very long time with one hand resting on the page, looking out the window. He had spent 36 years doing one thing, not killing people. He had never killed anyone. He had never even held a gun outside the mandatory firearms training in 1991. His work was to see the crack before the wall collapsed. Augustine's father had hired him for that, had paid him for 36 years to do that, and during those 36 years, Hal had removed 7 things from the body of this family before they had a chance to spread, and not one of those 7 things had understood what was happening to them. He hadn't hated any of them. He had even liked a few. For the next 3 days, Hal did nothing. He ate breakfast at the long dining room table, in the chair to Gus's right, where he had sat since 2008, and Barnaby Quill poured his coffee at 7:15 every morning, just as he had for 36 years, and not once during those 36 years had Hal raised his eyes to look at the face of the man pouring it. He read the newspaper. He made 2 calls concerning the harbor, and he watched Augustine Ferraro. And he saw the man eat 3 bites at lunch instead of 2, and he saw the faded cloth-bound notebook lying on the study desk instead of inside the safe, and he understood that this crack wouldn't close by itself. On the morning of Tuesday, November 24th at 10:15, Hal Dunbridge made a telephone call from the landline in his office. The call lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He didn't apologize. He didn't say he was sorry about what had happened to Miss Marisol. He offered nothing, promised nothing, threatened nothing, and he didn't mention the cake, the notebook, or that Saturday morning. He told Theodore Vance Drury that a woman worked in the kitchen of the Ferraro mansion. He read her name slowly and spelled her surname. Rosalind Holloway. He said she was the legal guardian of a younger brother, and that the child was receiving long-term treatment at a medical facility in Warwick, and that the cost of that care was far beyond the means of someone working 2 jobs for hourly wages. Then he thanked the man for his time and hung up. He sent no letter. He submitted no file to anyone, not to the police, not to a prosecutor, not to any federal agency, because a consigliere never willingly placed a single written word where an outsider might read it. And because a man who had spent 36 years protecting a family didn't hand that family over to anyone. He merely gave a name to an angry man. He gave it to a lawyer who had practiced for 41 years, a man with every instrument already in his hands, every motive already inside his chest, and 3 empty weeks before Christmas afterward, Hal Dunbridge set down the receiver, opened the small notebook, and drew 1 dot beside the line he had written 3 days earlier. Then he closed the notebook, returned it to his inner pocket, and went downstairs for lunch. Theodore Vance Drury didn't need 3 weeks. He needed 11 days. He was a 64-year-old man who had practiced law for 41 years, and never once in his life had he needed to lie in order to destroy someone, because he understood very clearly, more clearly than anyone else in Boston, that the truth, placed in exactly the right position, was sharper than any slander. He didn't write a single word that wasn't true. He simply sent what he knew to the places that were obligated to care. He sent the Financial Compliance Department of the medical facility in Warwick a 4-page statement, complete with citations to regulations and case numbers, explaining that the legal guardian of a patient undergoing long-term treatment had reported an annual income of $19,800 from 2 hourly wage jobs, while the family's out-of-pocket expenses during the previous 4 months had exceeded $13,000, and that this person was currently employed inside the household of Augustine Ferraro, an individual whose name had appeared in 3 open federal investigations during the previous 8 years. He sent a copy to the review board. He sent another copy to the Rhode Island State Office of Child Protective Services. He didn't telephone anyone. He asked no favors. He merely stamped the documents, signed them with his professional seal, and placed 3 envelopes into the mailbox, on the corner 40 meters from his office, then went to lunch with an old friend and spoke about football season. Not 1 bullet left a barrel. Not 1 man was taken to the harbor. No one touched anyone, no one raised a voice, and the entire thing unfolded in daylight, completely legally, entirely according to procedure, carried out by conscientious people, performing their duties exactly as required. On the morning of Wednesday, December 9th, Rosie Holloway returned to the third-floor apartment in Olneyville after finishing the third shift at the diner on Broad Street. She was tired in a way sleep could no longer repair. Inside the metal mailbox mounted at the foot of the staircase, between a pizza advertisement and an electricity bill, was a large white envelope bearing the medical facility's logo in the upper left corner. She carried it upstairs. She placed it on the kitchen table beside the stack of bills held together with the blue paper clip. She washed her hands. She put water on to boil. She sat down, then she opened it. The letter contained 3 paragraphs. The first thanked her for her cooperation during the patient's treatment and confirmed that she was the legal guardian listed in the official record. The second informed her that the facility had received information raising questions about the source of payments made under her name between July and November, and that under mandatory financial transparency regulations governing patients undergoing review, the facility was required to refer the matter to the board for examination. The third paragraph, written in the same language, in the same typeface, with the same line spacing, informed her that while the board's decision was pending, the patient's file would be temporarily removed from the waiting list, and that she could submit additional documentation within 30 days of the date on which the notice had been issued. At the bottom of the page, a small line in italics stated that the letter had been generated automatically and required no reply. Rosie read all 3 paragraphs. Then she began again from the top, more slowly, tracing each line with her finger like someone learning how to read. She read it a third time. The water in the kettle boiled and switched itself off, and she didn't rise. Outside the window, a bus stopped at the corner and continued on. Someone on the floor below closed a door. She sat motionless at the kitchen table, with the paper spread before her and both hands resting on either side of it without touching it. And there was nothing on her face. No tears, no sound. Only something withdrawing very slowly from her eyes, like water receding from a stretch of sand, and what remained behind was a look no one in her life had ever seen. Not the bakery owner who had cried when he dismissed her, not the social worker who had sat in the corner during those 30-minute visits, not the woman in the administrative building who had pushed the paper toward her when she was 18. She understood very quickly. She wasn't stupid. She had never been stupid, and she had lived long enough, at the bottom of this world, to know that letters like this didn't appear by themselves. She thought about the cake. She thought about the heel of the shoe. She thought about the woman in the silk morning robe, climbing the oak staircase without looking back. And then she thought about something else, something colder than all of it, that the name that had ruined her brother wasn't Marisol Vance Drury. It was the name written directly beneath hers in the personnel records of a mansion on a hill, the name of the man who had eaten the bowl of egg noodles she cooked at 1 o'clock in the morning, the man who had ordered the kitchen light left burning all night, the man who had removed the ring from his fiancée's hand to defend the dignity of a cake she had baked. Kindness from a man like that wasn't a gift. It was an ink stain. It soaked through the paper, onto the page behind it, onto every page beneath, and it couldn't be erased. 22 miles to the south, inside a room with a window overlooking the red maples that had now lost nearly all their leaves, a boy who had just turned 10 was sitting and drawing. He drew a long table, and on the table there was a cake, and he was trying to draw candles, but the candles kept leaning, and he knew nothing. He still kept the paper hat inside the drawer beside his bed, and he hadn't once asked anyone why his sister had arrived later than usual the previous Saturday, or why her eyes had been red. On the morning of Thursday, December 10th, Rosie Holloway went up to the 2nd floor for the 2nd time in her life, and this time no one stopped her. Barnaby Quill saw her walking down the hallway with a white envelope in her hand, and he didn't move, and he would remember that for a very long time, that he had stood still a 2nd time. The study door was open. Augustine Ferraro sat behind the desk with the faded cloth-bound notebook, resting to his left instead of locked inside the safe, and he looked up. Rosie placed the letter on the desk between them and stepped back once, exactly as she had done with the Polaroid in the pantry 6 weeks earlier. Gus read the 3 paragraphs. He read them once. He didn't need to read them again. He remained still for a moment, then raised his eyes and said the matter would be resolved, that he would make several telephone calls that afternoon, that her brother's name would be restored to its proper place before Christmas, and he said all of it in the flat and utterly certain voice of a man who had never encountered a problem that money or fear couldn't solve. Then he reached for the telephone. "No," Rosie said. His hand stopped in midair. She said no again, and her voice was very quiet, and she looked down at the letter on the desk instead of looking at him. "Read the second paragraph again." Gus lowered his eyes. The second paragraph spoke about the source of the payments. It spoke about a name that had appeared in 3 open federal investigations during the previous 8 years. It didn't say anyone had given her money, because no one had given her a single cent. She had never accepted $1 from him beyond the hourly wage written into her contract. It only said that she worked inside his house. That was her entire crime. "Don't you understand?" she said. "If you make those calls, then everything in this letter becomes true. They will see a man like you interfering with the medical file of a child, and everything they suspect about me will be proven in a single afternoon. The closer you stand to me, the faster I sink." Gus said nothing. For 18 years he had silenced powerful people across the state simply by entering their rooms. He had never encountered a situation in which his presence itself was the thing killing someone he wanted to save. It was something he couldn't buy, couldn't shoot, couldn't send to the harbor, and it was the second time in 3 weeks that such a thing had happened to him inside that house. He asked whether she was afraid of him. Rosie raised her head and looked directly into his face. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. "I'm afraid of your name standing beside mine on a piece of paper." She said that for 9 years she had moved very slowly and very carefully, so that her name would remain clean in every record in the state, and she had succeeded. And now it was no longer clean, and it would never be clean again for as long as she continued walking through the gates of that house every morning. Then she said she was resigning. She said she would finish her shift that day. She thanked him for the 14 months. Gus sat behind his desk and couldn't speak a single word, and the man who had once sat without blinking in silence, across from someone about to die, now looked down at the walnut desktop, where a strip of December sunlight lay beside the faded cloth-bound notebook. Rosie left the room. She finished her shift. She washed the dishes from lunch, cleaned the stove, and returned the pots to the rack in the exact order the person who came after her would expect to find them. At 5 o'clock that afternoon, she removed her apron, folded it, and placed it on the steel counter, and beside it she set down the 2 broken pieces of wood she had carried in her apron pocket for the previous 19 days, the 2 halves of a cheap spoon, bought 3 for $1 at the grocery store, beneath an apartment building in Olneyville. She placed them side by side in the proper direction. She looked at them once. Then she put on her coat and walked out through the side door. She passed through the service hallway, past the row of gray metal lockers, and didn't stop. She didn't open locker number 14. She had forgotten it existed, forgotten completely, in the way people forget something when their minds have room for only one other thing, and the key remained attached to the elastic band around her wrist throughout the entire journey back to Olneyville that evening, and she never looked down at it once. At 9:40 that night, her telephone vibrated on the kitchen table. An unfamiliar number. She answered and said hello, and on the other end she heard ice clinking inside a glass, then a voice she had heard only twice in her life, once asking who had brought this and once ordering her to clean it. "I just spoke with my father," Marisol said. "He told me not to call you. He said it was unprofessional." She paused. Rosie heard the woman take a drink. "You know," Marisol said, "I gave 3 years of my life to that man. 3 years. I learned how to sit in silence when he didn't speak. I learned not to ask where he went at night. I stood beside him at the funerals of people whose names I didn't even know. And you baked him a cake." Rosie didn't answer. She looked out the window, where a bus stopped at the corner, and then continued on. "I didn't destroy you," Marisol said. "I didn't even remember your name until last week. You did this to yourself when you entered that house and imagined that kindness came without a price." Then her voice softened, almost tenderly. "And that was the worst part of the entire call. Don't cry," she said, "when that name disappears from the list." Then she ended the call. Rosie placed the telephone on the kitchen table. She stood there for a very long time inside the 3rd-floor apartment in Olneyville beneath the bare round light bulb. And she didn't cry. She had already cried. She had cried on the tiled floor of a service hallway at 1 o'clock in the morning on November 21st, for 17 minutes without making a sound, and she had spent all the tears she had on 4 words inside a message. She washed the cup in the sink. She dried her hands. She went into the bedroom and lay down, and she stared at the ceiling, and she began calculating from the beginning, in numbers, how much a person with 2 hands like hers could earn in 30 days. Inside the mansion on the hill, there was an extension telephone mounted on the dining room wall beside the door, leading into the pantry, and it had been there since before Barnaby Quill was hired in 1986. It had been installed so the master of the house could call the kitchen without having to walk there. No one had used it in 20 years, but it was still connected to the same line as the landline in Hal Dunbridge's first-floor office, and whenever he lifted the receiver, a very faint click sounded in the dining room, a sound recognized by only one person in the world, because he had stood inside that room for 40 years and knew every sound it made as intimately as he knew his own breathing. On the afternoon of Friday, December 11th, at 4:20, Barnaby was polishing the silverware when he heard that click. He put down the piece of felt. He took 3 steps toward the wall and lifted the receiver slowly, then placed his palm over the mouthpiece. He listened for 2 minutes and 10 seconds. He heard Hal Dunbridge tell someone in Boston that the matter was finished, that the facility had issued the notice, that the woman had resigned the previous day, and that everything would now settle by itself as long as no one disturbed it again. He heard Hal thank the man for handling the matter quickly and cleanly. He heard the receiver being replaced. Then he lowered his own receiver just as slowly, and he stood motionless before the wall, for a length of time he would later be unable to estimate. For 40 years, he had poured coffee for that man at 7:15 every morning. 36 years, to be exact, since Hal Dunbridge, at 26, first sat in the chair to the right of the master of the house in that dining room. Barnaby had poured tens of thousands of cups of coffee for him. He knew Hal preferred his coffee cooler than other people did, knew he folded the newspaper into quarters rather than halves, knew he never ate the final piece of bread in the basket. And during those 36 years, not once, not one single time, had Hal Dunbridge raised his head to look into the face of the man pouring for him. That was why no one had thought to disconnect the extension telephone in the dining room. People didn't switch off the things they never saw. Barnaby went upstairs to the 2nd floor. He knocked on the study door, entered, and spoke exactly 4 sentences to Augustine Ferraro, using the same flat voice with which he had spoken about flour and water, and when he finished, he stood there and waited. Gus didn't ask him to repeat himself. He didn't ask whether Barnaby was certain. He looked at his 68-year-old steward for 4 seconds, exactly the same 4 seconds he had looked at him in the ballroom 3 weeks earlier, and this time Barnaby raised his head and returned the look. By 11 o'clock that night, 2 of Gus's men were at the harbor. They parked in the shadow of a row of shipping containers and reported that the black Lincoln had arrived at 10, that it was parked beneath the 4th light pole from the gate, and that the person inside hadn't left the car, made a telephone call, or done anything at all. At midnight, Gus drove there alone. He passed through the gate, drove between 2 rows of containers, and parked about 20 meters from the Lincoln, slightly to its left, in exactly the position his father had taught him to use when he was 17. Orange security lights poured over the wet pavement. The smell of salt, engine oil, and cold steel filled the air. He sat inside his car and looked across. The person behind the wheel of the Lincoln wasn't Theodore Vance Drury. Hal Dunbridge had been sitting there for 2 hours. He carried no gun. He had never carried a gun in his life, and his car door was unlocked, and the interior light was on so anyone who approached could clearly see both his hands resting on the steering wheel. Gus stepped out. He walked 20 meters across the wet pavement, opened the passenger door, and sat down. The car was warm. The radio was off. A small leather-bound notebook lay face down on the dashboard. The 2 men sat in silence for 30 seconds. Then Hal spoke without turning his head. "I tied your necktie at your father's funeral," he said. "You were 16. Your hands were shaking so badly that you couldn't hold the 2 ends. I stood behind you in the funeral home bathroom and tied it for you, and I told you to count to 10 before walking outside." He paused. "Your hands don't shake anymore," he said. "That is what I taught you. For 36 years, little by little, I taught you how to keep your hands from shaking. and I'm no longer certain that I should be proud of it." Gus said nothing. "Your father would have pulled the trigger 20 minutes ago," Hal said. "He wouldn't have left his car. He would have signaled one of his men, gone somewhere for a late supper, and slept peacefully afterward. I know because I stood beside him when he did it, to people who were closer to him than I am." He looked up at the light pole through the windshield. "I sat here for 2 hours," he said, "to find out whether you are your father's son. And if I'm not?" Gus asked. It was the first thing he had said since entering the car. Hal turned his head. He looked directly into the face of the 34-year-old man beside him, and he looked for a long time, and there was no fear in his eyes and no hope either. Only something very close to the exhaustion of a man who had just realized that the work of his entire life had been built on ground he had chosen badly. "Then have breakfast with me tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll pay." Gus remained silent. Then he reached inside his coat and took out a faded cloth-bound notebook, opened it beneath the orange light falling through the windshield, turned to the final page, and reread a line he had spoken aloud in the ballroom 3 weeks earlier. "Sha fame, saha pora, when you are hungry, when you are afraid." He read it silently without moving his lips, and he sat with the notebook open across his knees for nearly 2 minutes. He wasn't hungry that night. He wasn't hungry at all. He closed the notebook. He took out his telephone, dialed a number, and when someone answered, he spoke 3 words and ended the call. Let him go. Then he opened the car door and stepped into the cold, closing it very gently behind him, and he walked 20 meters back to his own car without looking behind him once. The interior light of the Lincoln continued burning for a long while after he was gone. At 7:15 the following morning, Barnaby Quill carried the coffee pot into the dining room. He placed the first cup before Augustine Ferraro. Then he walked around the head of the table, placed the second cup before the chair on Gus's right, filled it, stepped back once, and waited. The chair was empty. Hal Dunbridge had left Rhode Island at 4 o'clock that morning. He left no letter and called no one. And the small leather-bound notebook in which he had written for 36 years was lying on the dashboard of a black Lincoln parked at the airport, with its doors unlocked. And when it was found, not one person in the world could read a single word inside it. For an entire month, locker number 14 in the service hallway remained locked. Barnaby Quill passed it at least 4 times every day and never touched it, because he possessed the spare keys to all 14 lockers in that row, and had possessed them for 40 years. And he had never opened one without permission. He thought she would come back. People always came back for their belongings. She didn't. On the morning of Saturday, January 10th, the mail carrier delivered a thick envelope from the Rhode Island Family Court addressed to Rosalind Holloway at the mansion, because she hadn't yet changed her mailing address and perhaps hadn't even thought to do so. Barnaby held it for a long time. Then he went into the service hallway with the spare keys and opened locker number 14, only to search for some scrap of paper bearing her address, a bill, a pay stub, anything at all. Inside was a spare pair of shoes, an empty bottle of water, a small box of pain medicine, and a stack of white envelopes bound with a rubber band stretched loose from age, as thick as a pocket dictionary, none stamped, none addressed. He stopped looking for her address. He sat on the wooden chair in the service hallway, the chair no one ever used, and removed the rubber band. He read for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He didn't read them all, he read enough. On Thursday, January 14th, a hearing was held inside a small room on the 3rd floor of the family courthouse on South Main Street in Providence. And it wasn't a trial but a case review, with 3 board members seated behind a long table and a presiding judge named Alcott. Rosalind Holloway arrived 40 minutes early. She had no attorney. She couldn't afford one, and she had already calculated that even if she possessed the money, it ought to be spent on something else. She carried a blue plastic file folder containing wage statements from both her jobs for the previous 3 years and 214 receipts arranged chronologically and clipped into monthly groups with paper clips. She wore the collared shirt she had pressed with a kettle of hot water. When she was invited to speak, she stood. She thanked the board for its time. She read her brother's case number. She explained that the payments mentioned in the letter hadn't come from her former employer, that she had never accepted a single cent beyond the wage stated in her contract, and she said she didn't know where the money had come from, and she said it honestly because it was true, and she had spent 30 days trying to invent another answer and had failed. Then the presiding judge asked her a question about 2017. He asked why, at 18, she had signed away guardianship of her younger brother. He asked politely. He was only doing his job. There were 11 people in the room, and a ceiling fan turning slowly, and Rosie Holloway stood with both hands resting on the edge of the wooden table. When I was 18, she said, I had $31. Her voice caught once, only once, on the fourth word. She drew a breath. They told me that if I kept him, both of us would be sleeping on the street before winter. They said it very kindly. They weren't wrong. I believed them. I signed. She stopped. Then I went outside, she said, to the grass behind the building, and I vomited there. No one saw. I wiped my mouth, walked home, and went to work the night shift that evening. For the next 9 years, I worked to buy back that signature. I bought it back in June of 2021. Members of the board, I am not standing here to ask for forgiveness. I know what I did. I am only asking you not to make me sign a second time. No one spoke. The ceiling fan continued turning. Then, at the back of the room, in the row of chairs against the wall, a 68-year-old man stood. He wore a gray wool coat and carried a thick bundle of papers bound with a rubber band. He asked permission to present something. He walked forward and placed the bundle on the table before the board, carefully, with both hands, as one might set down something fragile. The judge asked what it was. 102 cards, Your Honor, Barnaby Quill said. 102 months. She wrote one at the end of every month beginning in August of 2017, and she didn't stop when she brought her brother home, and she never sent a single one to anyone. She counted every month. No one in the room opened even one card. They only looked at the bundle and counted it with their eyes, and one member of the board raised a hand to cover her mouth. Barnaby drew out 4 cards and read them in the same flat voice he had used for 40 years when speaking about silverware and flour. March. I found work at the laundromat. I saved $64. July. I burned my hand. It's all right. I can still cook. November. You turned 3 today. I don't know what color you like. He stopped. He lifted the final card, the one resting on top, and read it. November. I'm sorry. I'll bring the cake tomorrow morning. Then he placed a second document on the table, a notarized declaration signed on January 12th. In it, he stated that every co-payment and travel expense recorded in Patrick Holloway's treatment file between July and November of 2026, totaling $13,924, had been paid by him, Barnaby Quill, from his personal account with money obtained by selling a wristwatch in July of that year. That the legal guardian had known nothing about it, that not $1 had come from Augustin Ferraro or any asset associated with him. The judge asked why. Barnaby Quill stood straight. My former employer gave me that watch in 2003, he said, because I remained silent. I wore it for 23 years. I thought it was time to use it for the opposite purpose. He looked down at his hands. 23 years ago, he said, there was a basement kitchen inside that house. After the mistress died, an order was given to lock it. The master didn't do it with his own hands. I did. I took the lock, hung it on the latch, turned the key, and placed the key inside my pocket. I did it because I needed the job more than I needed my dignity, and I lived with that for 23 years, and I couldn't undo it. No one could. But I could pay for a child I had never met, and I could dictate to a young woman the thing I myself had helped bury. He was silent for a moment, and throughout the room there was only the sound of the ceiling fan. The night she baked it, he said. I stood in the hallway for 40 minutes. I could smell it through the door. I didn't dare go inside. Rosie Holloway turned to look at him. Her mouth opened, and no sound came out. In the final row beside the door, a 34-year-old man wearing a dark coat had been sitting silently for the previous 40 minutes, and no one in that room knew who he was, not the judge, not even the woman standing before the board. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't speak. He rose very quietly, stepped out of the room, and the door closed behind him before Rosie had time to turn her head. On a Saturday morning in the middle of May, 6 months after the night, a cake was crushed beneath a heel on the marble floor. The maples in Warwick had turned green again, and a 10-year-old boy sat beside a second-floor window, drawing a whale wearing a chef's hat. And he said the whale also had 6 fingers, even though whales didn't have any fingers at all, and he laughed before he finished saying it, as he always did. His name had been restored to the list at the end of January, after the board concluded that there was nothing irregular in the records of his legal guardian, Rosalind Holloway. He was still waiting. No one knew how long the wait would be. His sister visited him every Sunday and now on Tuesday afternoons as well, because she worked only one job, and she cooked for him in the small room with an electric stove reserved for patients' families, and he still complained that she was a terrible cook, and he still ate everything. The basement kitchen in the mansion on the hill was reopened in February. It didn't become a wine cellar. The peeling wallpaper was replaced, the chimney was repaired, and the cast iron oven wasn't removed. It was only cleaned, and a fire was lit inside it for the first time since 2003, and that morning, 3 men stood watching the flames burn without saying a word. From then on, every Saturday, the side door of the house remained open, from 8 o'clock in the morning until 9 o'clock at night, and anyone from Federal Hill who walked inside was given something to eat, with no registration, no documents, and no one asking their name. A small wooden sign hung on the door, bearing only 2 words, Constance's Table. The people in the neighborhood didn't know who owned the house. Some said it belonged to a charitable foundation. Some said it belonged to a church. They only knew that on Saturdays there was cake. Rosie Holloway didn't live in the mansion and had never set foot on its 3rd floor. She rented a 2-room apartment in the northern part of the city with her own wages, an apartment with a lock on the door and a dining table large enough for 2 people, and she paid the rent on the 5th day of every month with a check bearing her own name. She and Augustine Ferraro didn't live together. There was no wedding, no proposal, and not $1 passed from one hand to the other. They cooked together every Saturday, from 6 o'clock in the morning until the final guest left. And that was all, and both of them understood that if anything more were added, the thing they were preserving would break. On the long wooden table in the middle of that basement kitchen lay a wooden spoon. It had been repaired with glue and a thin strip of tin wrapped around the fracture, clumsily and slightly crooked, and the handle was still worn away toward the left. It was ugly. It worked. Rosie stirred with it every Saturday morning, and no one in the neighborhood ever asked why a kitchen containing everything kept a spoon like that. In the 1st floor dining room of the mansion, every morning at 7:15, Barnaby Quill still carried in the coffee pot. He placed the first cup before the master of the house. Then he walked around the head of the table, placed a second cup before the chair on the right, and filled it. That chair had remained empty for 6 months. No one sat there. Augustine Ferraro had never once told him to stop, and Barnaby had never once asked. Some mornings Gus sat for a very long time before the second cup as it grew cold, and later, when someone asked him about it, he only said that Barnaby still poured 2 cups, and he still left the second one untouched, and both of us knew what we were doing, and neither of us spoke about it. On a Saturday afternoon near the end of May, when the kitchen had nearly emptied, Gus took a small piece of paper from his wallet, its edges yellowed, the paper softened from being folded and unfolded too many times. On it were 2 letters, 1 period, and 1 number. He placed it on the wooden table before Rosie. He asked what it meant. She looked at it for a long time, then said it was my brother's birthday cake. He turned 10 the following day. Gus was silent. Did he get to eat any of it, he asked. No, she said. The man sat for a long time inside the basement kitchen, where his mother had stood for 19 years, looking down at the small piece of paper, while outside children ran across the yard. Then he spoke in the quiet voice he had always used. Then there must be cake every Saturday. That afternoon, a boy of about 7 came inside with his grandmother. He stared at the tray of cake on the table for a long time, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins he had taken from a piggy bank he had broken open, and he asked how much one piece cost. Rosie set down the spoon. She walked around the table and sat down, all the way down on the floor, so that her eyes were level with his. There is no price, sweetheart, she said. People pay only for the things they buy, not for the things they are given. The boy thought about that for a moment, then returned the money to his pocket, took the piece of cake in both hands, and ran outside with his grandmother. Some men build entire empires and never eat enough to feel full. Some women possess only $40 and 2 damaged hands, and they still find a way to give. Power isn't the ability to humiliate a human being before 60 others who stand staring down at their own shoes. Power is the thing that makes a man who stopped counting the journeys to the harbor long ago sit down on the cold tiled floor of his own kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning because of a $40 cake that all his wealth could never buy. We don't measure the worth of a person by what they bring to the banquet table. We measure it by what they are willing to give when they know with certainty that no one will ever see. Kindness doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need recognition, doesn't need repayment, and sometimes it must travel through many years of silence before someone finally smells it through a closed door. If this story touched you, please take a moment to press the like button, share it with someone you believe needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to new stories every day. We would truly like to know how you feel about Rosie, about Barnaby, about the man who sat down on the kitchen floor at 3 o'clock in the morning. Which detail remained longest inside your heart? Please leave a comment and tell us in the words that come from the deepest part of your heart, because every line you write is read and every one of them matters to us. May everyone listening today always have good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for staying with us until the final words. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next story.